Hi folks, welcome to RJ Impact. It's been a couple of weeks since I last posted and I hope you didn't miss me too much and no sarcastic comments about we didn't really notice. Let's get to it. They're not playing me, they're playing a character I created. Now, in case you hadn't guessed by the cover of this and the reason you're here anyway, these were the words of one Ms. Elizabeth Holmes, who has had an interview with the New York Times, and she has finally come clean about this persona she developed while running the erstwhile biotech company Theranos. She was saying this in respect of the actors who've portrayed her, notably Amanda Seyfried in the miniseries The Dropout, for which Amanda, not Elizabeth, won an Emmy. Elizabeth's getting her just desserts for her years of acting, I guess, right at the moment. Anyway, after years and years of essentially silence, only letting her lawyers speak on her behalf, or should I say except for the pitiful woe is me speech she gave whilst trying to avoid a lengthy prison sentence, Elizabeth has spoken. And by the way, in what I consider that pitiful attempt to persuade the Judge de Villa not to give her a long sentence, she said, "I stand before you taking responsibility for Theranos. It was my life's work. I'm devastated by my failings. I felt deep pain for what people went through because I failed them. To investors, patients, I am sorry. I regret my failings with every cell of my body." Spoiler alert, that didn't work. So, facing over a decade in prison, obviously giving her children the benefit of her absence during their formative years, Holmes has finally spoken out. Sort of. She's only given one interview, so I can't really add any other factual substances to what's been reported in that. So I'll bring things up to date with the current attempts to avoid jail time, and unusually for me, then give an opinion or two on the article that has been recently published in the New York Times. And there has been a lot of backlash against the New York Times, who ran the piece a couple of days ago, and I'll explain more on that. Let's get things right up to date. Sunny Balwani first. As you know, his attempt to stave off jail while he fights his appeal got to its final act with the Court of Appeal turning down his arguments. As a result, he now has the luxury of a sea view rather than the inside of either a courtroom or a lawyer's office. How nice for him. Actually, although a lot is said about Holmes laying low since her indictments back in 2005-06, originally by the SEC, yes, it really is that long. Anyway, Balwani has actually remained even lower key, if that's possible, during the period too. Enough of Balwani anyway. Now to Holmes. She's been following the same process as Balwani has, in that she has appealed firstly to Judge de Villa, who oversaw the court case, and now to the Court of Appeal. The main difference between Balwani's and hers cases, after all it was originally a joint case until she made the "I was abused" defence, is that Balwani was found guilty on all 12 counts against them, but she was found guilty of just 4. Mind you, in saying just 4, several $100 million involved, hey? But perhaps 4 versus 12 somehow garners merit. I'm not quite sure about that. Anyway, about a month ago, maybe 6 weeks, she had the honour of seeing Judge de Villa again to plead that essentially she was a special person and should be out free, while the appeal against her sentence takes place. And no joy for Ms. Holmes, I'm afraid, as he didn't agree with her, or her lawyers, and turned her down, telling her to attend prison instead. So she appealed to this, obviously to a court of appeal, and the same way as Balwani did, and she bought herself a few extra weeks of freedom. We'll find out what the Court of Appeal thinks about this in the next about 4 to 6 weeks now, by my reckoning. Oh, as a total aside here, jail versus prison, to me they're synonymous, and I do appreciate there is a bigger difference in the US, and you've got the federal distinction as well, which covers cross-border crimes. Perhaps one of you can tell me whether I can interchange them, or should I be specific about whether it's jail or prison? I'd truly like to know. Anyway, jail to me reminds me somewhat of those old cowboy movies where there was always the protagonist innocent but locked up by the sheriff anyway, who was usually on the side of the guys with the black hats. Oh, and there was always some kind of drunk person in the corner sleeping off some misdemeanor or something, but I digress. Now, I was a bit flippant there, but there is actually a fundamental difference between Holmes' appeal and Balwani's, in that Holmes' lawyers are saying that there was exculpatory evidence excluded from her trial, which, had it been brought in front of the jury being exculpatory, they would have found her innocent. Now, these were the points about Balwani and her claims of control and abuse against her, which weren't brought up. So a nice 5-minute preamble to the actual article itself, the New York Times article. And it is a puff piece by anybody's reckoning. So it was written by a reporter named Amy Chozick, and she had the pleasure of the interview and duly wrote 5,000 words. Amongst the most truly terrifying insights and the real hard journalistic endeavours to find out what the motivation was for someone who essentially shamelessly carried out a nearly $1 billion fraud and then persecuted and ruined the lives of her employees if they didn't show and demonstrate to her obsequiousness, civility, empathy with a crackpot invention, the Edison, and with at least one employee taking their own lives, considered to be largely a result of Holmes' persecution. Amy really did get to it. She wrote, Liz, as she likes to be called, likes antioxidant smoothies. Apparently partial to Mexican food, and she's a doting mother to 2 young children, and she despises R-rated movies and has been volunteering for the last couple of years at a crisis hotline. And she just doesn't relent. She follows up these hard jabs at Elizabeth Holmes' character with a knockout of all insightful unravellings as she goes on to say, I was admittedly swept up in Liz as an authentic and sympathetic person. She's gentle and charismatic in a quiet way. If you're in her presence, it's impossible not to believe her, not to be taken with her, and to be taken in by her. There you go, out for the count. So you've got to ask yourself then, was Chozick actually taken in by this person, Elizabeth? Let's not forget she managed to dupe some very high-powered elderly white males with her dress sense and youth. Sorry, did that come out loud? Sorry, I'd written, she managed to dupe the business and public communities at large with her charismatic personality, Machiavellian deviousness, and emulation of Steve Jobs with a polo neck, black tops. Oh, and red lipstick and bleached, immaculately ruffled hair. Sorry, just went sideways again. Back to it. And there isn't really much more to the interview than that. I will cover a couple of points later, but the article itself has garnered a huge amount of criticism. Where else can you go for the vox pop but Twitter? So I duly did. Maybe this article would have been served more by a discussion of sociopaths by political commentator Matthew Dowd. About Chozick, consistently crappy, CNN. Concise there. It is possible to be in her presence and not completely believe her. Questioning is what we do for a living, and that's by Scott Budman, a journalist, and he did extensive coverage of the trial, and I actually picked up a few tidbits from him that I inserted into some of my own pieces. In fact, I'll put a link to his Twitter account in the feed, pin it as the first message as a thank you there. And the New York Post. For every glowing puff piece you see trying to rehabilitate Elizabeth Holmes' image, I want you to remember something. She personally approved a 15-month clinical trial using a device she knew to be useless to measure cancer drug levels in the blood of terminal cancer patients. And finally on this section, a Fox News headline. Very embarrassing. The actual article itself was titled, Liz Holmes wants you to forget about Elizabeth. Amongst other superlatives, she's a devoted mother, modest but mesmerising, impossible not to believe. And I mentioned it before, but is there any substance? A couple of commonly known connivances were admitted to by Holmes. To be honest with you, I was taken back by this. She'd continued the sham of one or two of these right through the current day. With the deep voice. She has now admitted to not, as she put it, being authentic with the deep voice. What, making it up, you mean? That was pretty much it on the voice. I can't let it go. You know, as the bank robber takes off his monkey masks and says, it wasn't me, I wasn't being authentic. Look, this is what I look like, not the monkey. You got to think to yourself, oh, of course, in real life, he looks nothing like a monkey. I've got to believe him. I know what you're thinking. How on earth did this one reporter, what was her name again? Woodward, Bernstein? Oh, sorry, Amy Chozick. How did she manage to extract these vital facts about Holmes' nourishment and scoop the world to other key facts she's been holding back during the trial? Oh, she didn't. Well, not about the trial. Anyway, I'm glad Amy did manage to probe the dietary side of things. You've got to admit, other than references to the green drinks here and there, no one has got to the bottom of her current dietary preferences like Amy did. Well done. Well done, Amy. So, meetings in underground car parks and surreptitiously hanging around in the shadows to find out the facts? Sort of. Amy had to trek to the Evans multi-million estate several times, apparently. And further meetings? Well, with Holmes and Billy and their children, to the zoo. A perfect camouflage. Well done. Hats off to you, Amy. I'll give you a flavour of how I know that. Amy wrote, Elizabeth Holmes blends in with the other moms here in a bucket hat and sunglasses, her newborn strapped to her chest and swathed in a baby Yoda nursing blanket. We walked past a family of caged orangutans and talk about how Miss Holmes is preparing to go to prison for one of the most notorious cases of corporate fraud in recent history. She got close there, but I don't think she really actually said anything, did she? Anyway, you make up your own mind how the caged bars of the orangutans might be more relevant to Miss Holmes than any questions that Amy might be asking her. A couple more tweets. I hope everyone at the New York Times is embarrassed about Amy Chozick disaster. I get the Times copy desk is a mess, but phew, what an embarrassment for all the solid journalists everywhere. I love this one, Mutant Hippo replying to the New York Times at least. As the door opened, Jeffrey Dahmer looked magnificent. His love of yoga and cooking was the first thing that came to my mind. As Jeffrey said, I was in a very dark place back then. Things are different now. Amy Chozick. I've got to give this some balance, so let's have a look at this tweet. I only just got around to this. So many excited tweets. The tone and style of this profile of Elizabeth Holmes may not be to everybody's taste, but it's definitely not a puff police. A link for the curious. So I did what you're not supposed to do and I actually followed the link. And guess what? I got through to an article, or the article itself, by the New York Times, and it wasn't behind a paywall. I kid you not, so follow it. It really is for free there. How on earth could this person pull off such a coup? And you can see up here that this is actually Amy's retweet. She was so proud of this, she retweeted it, as she should be from this kind of write-up. So I followed his link onto his site. It's all becoming clear. He is the editor of the New York Times. It all makes sense. He must have been the one who approved the article. And now I understand. Good for you, hey Amy, retweeting the boss's own tweets. Gotta support him, hey. And what you really all wanted to know all along was the voice. It's gone. Sorry, the voice has gone. We'll never hear it again, I guess. Mind you, she probably would have had a hard time with the inmates maintaining that faux gravitas if she turned up with that voice and that attitude. Also, maybe dropping it is somewhat a self-defence. We learned that her youngest is called Invicta. And as they probe these deep matters, they listen to All That She Wants by Ace of Base, and this was at yet another of their rented homes. Amy makes this point herself, which I think is worth commenting on. If you hate Elizabeth Holmes, you probably think her feigned perma-hoarseness was part of an elaborate scheme to defraud investors. If you're a person who is sympathetic to Miss Holmes, then the James Earl Jones inflection was a sign of the impossible gymnastics that female founders must perform to be taken seriously. If you spend time with Miss Holmes like I did, then you might come away like me and think that, as with many things about Elizabeth Holmes, it was both. Either way, even Mr. Evans agrees, the voice was real weird. And another quote relating to the similar thing: how can you have an honest conversation with a person whose fraud trial has been played out so publicly? I tried to ask Miss Holmes this directly. How do I believe you when you've been convicted of, basically, lying? But how could I ask someone who was nursing her 11-day-old baby on a white sofa 2 feet away if she was actually conning me? Guess that's your job, Amy. Oh, the baby again. It's impossible for somebody who's had a baby to be guilty of anything. Nice insight there, Amy. There were a couple of areas that we heard about in the trial and then also way back from the John Carreyrou book. The assault on her that she said took place in Stamford while she was there apparently does have some groundings in a real incident. There's a police report that Amy actually went and looked at, although no charges were ever brought, Holmes herself dropping the case. And Holmes does mention that, and I'm not going to talk about it here. You know what it's about if you've followed this enough. And another mystery, her legal expenses, Holmes' legal expenses that is. She was asked who's paying for them, and Holmes said that I can't. I have to work for the rest of my life to pay for it. So was Mr. Evans' family paying? And she said no, or shook her head and said no apparently. So that is a mystery. There was one anecdote from Holmes' day-to-day life which I guess he's going to follow her around for the rest of that life, I guess. This was in a hospital when one of her youngsters had quite a significant fever, 105, which I believe is very significant. And so while she's dealing with this stress, the doctor looked at her and said, "You look a lot like that horrible woman. I'm sure you're a better person than she is." And then it dawned on the doctor, continuing to say, "Are you Elizabeth Holmes?" And I said, "Yes," Elizabeth said. And he said, "I'm so sorry." And Elizabeth said, "Don't be. All you know is what you've read." And this exchange all happened before the doctor scurried away to get the baby's blood tested on the Edison device they keep hidden away. She was asked about some of the intimidation. If you remember, some of the employees who were whistleblowers, or potentially even whistleblowers, were relentlessly pursued by legal firms, tracking them down, hanging around in car parks late at night, etc. Holmes said that she repeats what she said at the trial when she said, "I take responsibility for it because I was the CEO of the company, and at the end of the day, that's that. But I don't believe in people being treated that way, period." Words, words, words. Anyway, they asked David Boy's firm, what their response to her, who did try to cast the blame a little bit on the lawyers for doing all this harassment. And the response she got back was, "Whatever." Just brilliant in my mind. However, we have salvation on our hands. Holmes has ideas for COVID testing. She's still working on healthcare inventions, and she'll be doing this behind bars. And in response to this, I would suggest whoever your own particular saviour is, think about them and not providing mankind with a deliverance from COVID and all the other nasty infections that pervade our earth, but so that no one ever gives Holmes funding to pursue her dreams outside the bars of that room for the next 11 years. There were some somewhat incidental anecdotes. Apparently her and Billy Evans are living somewhat as pariahs, as that they are often moved on when the landlord realises who they are. My answer to that problem that they have is that I think that the Evans family can probably afford a modest 2-bed apartment for them out of the hundreds of millions that they have in the bank. And I think, to my mind, Holmes and Billy are living some kind of adventure, moving around from place to place as their whims and desires takes them. Oh, to be free from the shackles of life, hey? It's the shackles of a prison that, Holmes, you're going to have to look out for. If I was going to be somewhat generous, I suppose, Holmes, I think, has taken some steps towards coming clean. She dropped the voice, for example, and, said it was all a fake. So maybe she is starting to accept some level of responsibility. And clearly there's a long way to go, given that she's appealing her innocence even at the moment. So whilst we might have had baby steps, it really is that just at the moment. And on the other hand, Holmes has been a clever manipulator of people most of her life. Am I myself being naive? Probably. Anyway, it does seem that in Holmes' case there is no signs of the rage against the dying of the light. She is going gently, it appears. And do I have a disappointment from the whole article? Well, I do, and it's a big one. I would have loved to hear a recording of her voice as she speaks today. Oh, and wouldn't it be great if she could be persuaded to repeat one of those speeches, like at the TED Med or something like that? From "It's a basic human right" to "It's a basic human right." You won't get that one unless you saw the TED Med talk. Oh, just because I do and I could, there's a couple of quotes mixed in and mangled in, I think is probably more to the point in this whole speech, here or there. And I can offer just kudos points for anyone who gets one. And by the way, I often insert those because I'm just typing away and they just rattle off. I often think, oh, that's a novel thought, and then realise, oh, I've just copied what somebody else has said. Anyway, there you go. I left them in this time. I can't believe it. I've just made 22 minutes of really what amounts to nothing. Well, I had to make something of it because there was nothing there, but 22 minutes, oh wow. If anyone's here right now, respect to you, that's for sure. And on that, bye for now.